Welcome to the Execution is King podcast, where we talk to successful startup founders, investors, and ecosystem builders to uncover insights and best practices for the next generation of great global startups. I'm your host, Josef Siebert. Joining me today is co-host Rob Weber, partner at Great North Ventures. Our guest is Anna Mason, managing partner at Revolution's Rise of the Rest seed fund. Rise of the Rest invests in promising companies at the seed stage who are outside of Silicon Valley, New York City, and Boston.
I'm super excited to have Anna Mason. Really enjoyed getting to know her, but also the fun that she's with Revolution Rise of the Rest. I think it's just having such a tremendous impact around the country. In the late 90s, when I was kind of cutting my teeth as a teenager publishing websites and e-commerce businesses, Steve Case was really a legend in terms of the Web 1.0 and bringing the world online, but starting with America Online. A lot of the millennials out there probably aren't familiar with AOL, but I think it's just so tremendous, this sort of second chapter with Steve Case and partners Anna Mason and the rest of the team, what they're doing to really jumpstart innovation across the country. And I think it's just such important work. Really excited to have Anna on the podcast today.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, they're bringing these kind of more rural areas of America online, not literally through, rural broadband access or anything like that, which is incredibly important, but bringing capital and bringing these connections and then bringing the expertise that comes along with their huge networks from being someone like Steve Case.
Yeah, I think you're right on. And actually, Steve has a book on this, if anyone's interested. It's called The Third Wave, and he kind of talks about the different waves of the internet and technology adoption and how, again, for people who are a little younger than myself, the first wave of the internet was really very distributed. Companies like AOL were in Washington, D.C. My company was in Minnesota. There were successes all over. And then it was really in the last maybe 2 to 3 decades where San Francisco, and to another extent, maybe New York and Boston, started to kind of dominate venture capital and startups. And I think Steve's kind of premises proximity to the customers and to the markets that are in these more complex industry segments is really what is going to be most important in this third wave of the basically applications and technology. And I really believe that. I think many of the industries that have been sort of slow adopters of new technology, whether it's mobile, social, AI, blockchain, many of these industries are slow to adopt because they operate with complex systems that are hard for people sitting in maybe in a co-working space in San Francisco to understand, because those kind of businesses and industries aren't really common in those geographies. So really exciting to learn from what they're doing and to be a part of this third wave.
Yeah, well, enough about Steve. Let's get down to it. How'd you meet Anna?
So actually, the first time I met Anna Mason, she came out for a pitch event around the time we started our venture fund, Great North Ventures, 5 years ago. And we judged this event. And at the end of the event, we were talking about it. We voted on the startups. It was cool to see. We were both kind of discussing how we didn't really think that any of the participants would have been, quite right for our venture funds. And so it was interesting. I actually referred her a company we were considering, one of our Fund 1 portfolio companies. And based on that initial intro where we did a pitch session together, she flew in from Washington, D.C. to the Twin Cities. We ended up doing the deal together. So it was from first meeting to an investment opportunity. I think it all happened very quickly. And now we've done a number of deals together. So it's been, really getting to know Anna the last 5 years. It's been a lot of fun. And now it's definitely one of the funds that we pretty actively share deal flow with. So Anna, we're glad to have you on today. I know we've known each other about 5 years and have a few investments together. The first question we wanted to start with is, could you briefly describe your background and how you got into the venture capital industry?
Sure. Thanks, Rob. It's great to connect in this more public forum. I know we spend a lot of time chatting with each other about deals, and I'm really excited for you guys in the launch of this podcast. So my name is Anna Mason. I'm a proud Washington, D.C. transplant. I've lived in the district for about 6 years. I like to say I have my two favorite startups are my little girls, who are 2.5 and 5.5. They're fifth generation Washingtonians, and The responsible family life choice that led us to raise our kids in DC is very much so the reason why I'm there. But along the way, pretty early, and I got connected with Steve and Revolution team, and it's been a real privilege and an honor to just work alongside him and my other partner, our managing partner, David Hall, to really grow Rise the Rest. So my path into venture, I think, like many, is an interesting one. And part of what I love about our industry, but I also think can be a little bit challenging, is that there is no one clear check the box path into the industry. So I like to say that I have a bit of an eclectic portfolio of professional experiences that brought me into venture. I grew up professionally on Wall Street. I was a distressed and high yield bond and bank debt trader, and also dabbled in a bit of post reorg private equity over the years. Long story short, I had a very, very front row seat to the financial crisis and the Great Recession. Coming right out of school, I landed in a job that I thought was like the greatest thing since sliced bread, working at Lehman Brothers on their distress desk, which had a strong reputation. Little did I know that shortly after, a couple years after I joined, I would be trading our own bonds and bank debt on that desk through one of the largest corporate bankruptcies in history. What I would say briefly just about that experience, and how I think it tracks to my path into venture, is that I find myself very frequently thinking and somewhat frequently saying that venture is very much so like the other side of the coin from the distressed investing world. You're making big bets that typically have very binary outcomes. But the fundamental difference, and what I really love about our industry, and about our work at Rise the Rest specifically, is that in venture, you're really fundamentally betting on the bright side of the coin. And you're working with, partnering with, funding and backing entrepreneurs who are really functionally optimists, I think, reimagining the future, which is a wildly different universe from working in a subset of the financial markets that are focused on trading in the securities of companies who have missed the mark. They've either missed the innovation or have some measure of corporate malpractice that has taken their securities into a more distressed stage. So I learned a tremendous amount in the earliest days of my career, both from the standpoint of the nature of the work we did and I did on the distressed side, but also in having gone through a major corporate bankruptcy upheaval and merger thereafter. And that merger experience, going from Lehman to Barclays, taught me a tremendous amount about corporate culture. And it's a lot of what I try to apply from an investor lens standpoint into how we think about team construction and team values. Because at the end of the day, whether you're a seed stage startup with 5 employees, or you're a major conglomerate with 25,000 employees, or anything in between, at the end of the day, your organization is the sum of its people. And so, really kind of having a feel for the good, the bad, and the ugly there from some personal experiences early in my career certainly guided that experience. Wall Street was a love it and have to leave it experience. So, just kind of fast tracking here a little bit. My Wall Street recovery program took me to Southern California, and I lived in LA and got involved in the awesome, I guess years ago, still somewhat nascent startup community there, co founded a health tech startup called Burn This. We originally started in the boutique fitness booking space. Like so many, we pivoted early in the life cycle of our company when we realized we productized the wrong value proposition. Happy to talk more about that later. And that pivot led us into an opportunity where we really doubled down on community and the social psychology of fitness. And so it's been fascinating for me to see sort of the emergence in the 2.0 of a lot of social, like vertically focused social commerce companies kind of coming up in the market, because we were very much so playing in that space back in 2012, 2013. My co-founder and I both got pregnant, and we were in a great place with our business traction wise, but hadn't fully landed on our business model. So we had an awesome opportunity to soft land our company into a major private company in the space called Beachbody, which was a great home for some of our engineers and the technology and the platform itself. And I moved to DC for my responsible family life choice, which takes me close to present day. So I've been at Revolution for 5 years, and it's been a real privilege to work on scaling Rise the Rest.
So can you tell us a little bit about the thesis behind Rise of the Rest?
Yeah, at its core, I would sum up the thesis of Rise the Rest by saying we see opportunity first through the lens of geography. What that means in practice is that the guiding light and the sort of drive it home statistic that we have long focused on is that while the venture industry as a whole has grown tremendously as an asset class from $10 billion invested a year up to now I think north of $150 billion a year, 75% of the capital invested every year still goes to three places: California, New York, and Massachusetts. And so we believe very deeply and are delighted to put our money where our mouth is, that brilliant entrepreneurs can have and continue to build transformative companies anywhere in the country. But the tip of the spear in activating those opportunities is early stage seed capital. And so our model is what we call a catalytic co-investment model, where we are high volume early stage investors. And while we do invest across industry, over the years, we've sharpened our pencils to increasingly focus on opportunities that sit at the intersection of a handful of themes. And those four themes for us are infrastructure, resilience, digital transformation, and sustainability. And so that can take us into fintech, it can take us into healthcare, it can take us into hard infrastructure. I'm pretty sure I have a small child, my little startup, who somehow broke the lock and snuck in here. But that's the thesis for Rise the Rest in a nutshell.
So I'm a big fan of Rise of the Rest, and I know one of the things that it's known for are its bus tours all around America. I know that's been challenging to pull off during COVID, but I wonder if you could share with us a story or two in terms of the most unique or interesting startup ecosystems you've come across in your travels with Rise of the Rest.
Sure. Thanks, Rob. And excited to get you back out on the bus with us again whenever it is safe for us all to convene in that way again. So I've actually personally been to 47 cities and counting in the 5 years since I've been at Rise the Rest. And so these are always the hardest questions because picking just one or even two is tough. I thought I'd chat briefly about uh, two startup communities that might surprise people, even as, and I'm so heartened and pleased to see how much momentum the broader thesis and interest level in investing outside the coasts has become over the last couple of years. And so one community that I'm wildly bullish on is Tampa, the Tampa Bay community in Florida. I think it's most interesting to me, and I think is worth noting because Miami, sort of just across the state, has been getting so much fanfare and attention and opportunity, and frankly, I think rightfully so. I'm long Miami, insofar as that debate rages. But I think Tampa, long before COVID, and in particular through COVID, has had the opportunity to really kind of double down on the ecosystem that's developing there. So, some fun facts about the Tampa Bay region. Average age, I don't know if you want to wager a guess, Rob. Average age in Tampa Bay. What do you think?
I would think it's old. I think of Florida as being retirement oriented. So I'm going to say let's say 42.
Yeah, it's like 34. It's crazy. It's 34. We learned that when we went there a couple years ago, and you actually came in lower than I might have thought otherwise. But there's when we visited there a couple years ago pre-COVID, um, we got to see firsthand what Jeff Vinnick and Lakshmi Shenoy and the team at Embark Collective were building in the Tampa community. And what's super interesting about this, I think of it as what we called a work, live, play model in our 2019 Rise the Rest ecosystem playbook. There's a major real estate development underway there called the Water Street Project, the Tampa Bay Water Street Project. It's this like multi-billion-dollar, really like city renovation, if you think about it. And what I love so much about what was developed there with so much thought and intentionality is that as you redevelop different areas of a city, you have to have entrepreneurship top of mind and front and center. And that's where you had this really this like gem in this jewel box of Embark Collective, which was not only startup hub and community space, but it was really a collective to bring together leaders, mentors, investors to support this emerging generation of startups in the Tampa Bay community. And through that, they've really become this like magnet or beacon that gives people a landing place, not only for startups who are maybe relocating or maybe are homegrown in the region, but also for so much of the talent um, that's moving to Tampa from the Bay Area and otherwise, and either wants to pay it forward, wants to find that next opportunity, wants to mentor, wants to invest, wants to join a startup. And now there's a space for it. And I think creating that type of network density and concentration with intention can make all the difference in a startup community. So that's incredibly exciting to see. And I will also say, I don't think they've all been announced yet, but we have 4 investments in Tampa, up from 0 like 2 years ago. So it's really cool to see what's happening in that market.
That's really interesting to hear. I've actually been thinking about buying a place in Florida as I get older. The Minnesota winters are starting to catch up to me. But I was thinking more like southern Florida, not necessarily Tampa. So before I buy a place in the next couple years, I will have to spend time in Tampa and see what it's all about.
Yep. You got to check it out.
As a entrepreneur and investor, so much of success you see really comes from having a strong team and developing a team and talent. And I know with Rise of the Rest, you recently completed a nationwide career fair on Clubhouse, targeting all kinds of different local talent markets, such as the Twin Cities, which I participated in, and others. I saw you had this quote that you tweeted from Brian Chesky, the Airbnb co founder, who also participated. He said, "You'll never be in one place quite like you used to be. The place to be will be the internet." So I see a lot more small and medium cities rising up. I could really relate to that being I'm not super nomadic, but I spent a lot of time in the Twin Cities, a rural like lake town in Minnesota, and then also Chicago. But I don't like to be bogged down or tied down. And I think that really resonated with me, Brian's quote. But when you think about advice, as you're counseling founders through the investments that the Rise of the West or otherwise, what advice would you give to founders with respect to recruiting top talent? And, what do you think is working best right now? And I guess what do you think is not working?
So I love this question about place. Obviously, in our intro discussion, I highlighted that place really sits at the foundation of our investment thesis, our programmatic work, just everything we do centers around this idea and this philosophy, this mantra really that like place matters. And so as we moved into this space where the realities of COVID created, I think, what some people call Zoom land, like, you're sort of in nowhere USA, everywhere USA. The question about like, what does place mean, almost at the risk of sounding hyperbolic, sort of felt like it was taking on this like existential thread about how we should all be thinking about place. And one of the conclusions I've personally reached, in part informed by this intentional work we did through our tech talent tour, which, as you noted, Brian Chesky and Steve headline, but it was really intended to be a virtual career fair that could bring together active job seekers from all across the country with these startups who are in our portfolio. We had actually over 1,000 open jobs across the entire portfolio. So I think a couple things on this front. One is that I've personally come to the conclusion that we're in this moment that I'm calling like the great unbundling of place, where when you think about it, for even from like a venture investor standpoint, we're constantly chomping at the bit and looking for opportunities like, oh, is this industry being unbundled? And what does that mean for opportunity? And where does value get unlocked? And who can really, go after and chase this opportunity? I think we're seeing the same thing happen with place, where fundamentally like the value proposition of place, right, which is usually where you work and where you live are inextricably linked, is now unlocking and unbundling. And so just like when we think about industries that are being unbundled and value creation is happening for startups who are sort of jumping into that moment with a very specific product offering that really just focuses on sort of like one element of the previous bundle, I think you're kind of seeing the same thing happen where cities can really focus on the value prop of why you should live there, and companies can really focus on the value prop of like why you should work for us. For this to fully work, I think for cities and for companies and startups headquartered in Rise of the Rest cities, there probably actually needs to be some sort of partnership that happens between the city or the economic development authorities or the chambers and startups who often don't get as much attention as some of the later stage companies. So that's something I'm actually personally spending a bunch of time thinking about what could come next there that helps not only companies in our portfolios, but helps any startup in any emerging city across the country. And so all that's to say, while there's tremendous opportunity because you're seeing so many people move for individual startups, and I know all of our companies are feeling this on the front line, it's actually also challenging because now you're not just competing for talent in your own backyard. We heard this from one of our startups headquartered in Nebraska, where he's like, I used to be the best game in town for everyone, for all these engineers, but now suddenly they have remote opportunities in other places too. And so I think for companies to really put their best foot forward as they're trying to attract top talent in what is becoming very quickly like an increasingly competitive market, um, is that I think you really have to kind of let your personality shine. I think we've certainly entered this age from a consumer standpoint, and I think we're seeing this from an employee standpoint too, where values really matter a lot. And frankly, I think that culture and values, people operations is something that early stage startups maybe didn't always have the luxury of thinking about. But I've noticed, at least across our portfolio and in new companies we talk to, it's becoming increasingly important and prominent. So, two last quick things that I think came out of actually this talent tour. The first is we discovered, and it was an exciting discovery, that so many of our portfolio companies, even the early stage ones, have heads of people, chief people officers, VP of talent, like not just an HR person, but someone who is looking at the whole picture of what's our culture, what's our recruiting process, what's our training methodology, how do we really bring people into the fold. And I love the fact that that is front and center. And so I think that thinking about how you build that function in, and frankly, how that becomes not just the CEO's issue to think about, is an incredibly important tactical step that startups can take at this early stage. And the second is, frankly, just to really transparently reassess your policies for your team. We surveyed our portfolio as part of this talent tour effort, and we found that while fewer than 30% of our companies had remote work policies before COVID, more than 75% plan to have a policy, either already do now or plan to just have one for the foreseeable future. And on the flip side, of the nearly 2,000 active job seekers who RSVP'd to join us during this virtual career fair, 99% of them were interested in or open to remote work. There was like one person that wasn't interested, and 67% were interested in or open to relocation. And so I just think like flexibility is the name of the game these days. And it's a tricky terrain, I think, for startups to navigate because it can be distracting from a focus standpoint. So again, empowering someone on your team early who's sort of thinking about the people function most fully, I think is really beneficial.
So along with this unbundling of work from place, is kind of education from place as well. When you think of the UVP of these different cities, a lot of it has to do, at least nowadays, with the education that you can attain there. But you've been traveling around to these cities, you've been investing in these early stage startups, and obviously there is this unbundling of education happening right now. I don't know how progressed it's been, but there's all these things. I mean, Udemy, Coursera are the ones that immediately pop to mind, but then there's things like Lambda School as well, and all kinds of other opportunities to get the education you need to work specifically in like startup type careers that are really proliferating. But as far as like traction that you've seen, like at companies, have you seen people in leadership positions or these founders coming out of those kind of educational backgrounds? Have you seen any traction to that unbundling of place and education?
We've made some investments in that space in a couple different directions and are excited to track the progress of those companies. I can't think of specific examples of founders in our portfolio who have been graduates of those programs, but I know that there's active hiring that happens out of those programs. And I can say, I think one example of a company in that space is 2U. It's actually DC based, in our backyard in DC. They're a publicly traded company, which I think in and of itself speaks volumes to the potential of the industry and the potential for success and real traction and efficacy of that business model. But we actually partnered with them as one of our core talent partners on this recent talent tour that we did. And they brought a tremendous number of candidates through the platform. And I think what's interesting and what you see in some of the nuances of these models is you have many people who are actually also leaving their current career, like they're leaving their jobs sort of mid-cycle, mid-career professionals, I guess is the terminology, and they're inspired to be a part of positive change, which I think is fundamentally what our industry is all about. And while I don't have the specific stats for you on founders, something that a colleague of mine said a while back that's always stuck with me, is that you don't need to be a founder to be an entrepreneur. And I think having this spirit of innovation and opportunity and possibility is something that bleeds through startup cultures, whether you're the founder, you're employee number 5 or number 50. And I think you see a lot of those folks coming out of these programs into job opportunities in the startup space.
Yeah, I think that's right on. I think one of the values that I always tried to push really hard when I was as an entrepreneur was just shared around accountability, and I think that's one of the real benefits. So most startups provide employee stock appreciation plans or stock options, and I think that really kind of aligns. You really want your team to act as if they're owners and to take accountability when you're building a startup, and I think that really can support that kind of a culture where every employee is a founder, and I think it's really important. I was gonna maybe to change gears a little bit. I wanted to ask. So your partner is Steve Case. He's one of the true pioneers of the internet. I know when I was starting out in the late '90s as a teenager, hacking away at my first websites and e-commerce projects, AOL was just a force of really kind of bringing the internet to the masses across the country. What has it been like working with someone like Steve that, is really one of the true pioneers of the internet, really? How does that impact your day to day?
It's incredibly inspiring to work with Steve, and it always has been from day one. It's funny, part of my role over the years at Rise the Rest, and in addition to the investment purview, and has been overseeing sort of strategy and execution for our Rise of the Rest road trips, these bus tours that we do, and that I think we've become pretty well known for. And it's funny, I usually get 3 questions, and they've sort of followed me and us all through the years and through all the tours, coming up on our 9th one. And, the first 2 questions are, is Steve really on the bus? And the second question is like, is Steve running for president? And I've, sort of learned, my quick 1-2 punch is like, Steve is really on the bus. And he's to the best of my knowledge, he's not running for president. But I think that, that first point, it's really like literal, like when I say like Steve's on the bus, it's sort of both literal and figurative. He is, front and center and present in all the work that we do. And I think his dedication has been a constant source of inspiration to our partnership, to our team, to the cities that we visit. It's always been fun and a delight to see the way that people react to and interact with him, and to have the opportunity and the privilege to sort of be on the inside track of that has always been a lot of fun. There's also a tremendous amount of learning. I think most people are not strangers to sort of the brilliant marketing behind the rise of AOL and the CDs everyone always talks about. But I think I've seen and I've learned a lot of that kind of shine through in the way that he's conceived of, and we've expanded Rise of the Rest over the years. There's a very specific, very deliberate, high level message that I've always found so impressive and inspiring in terms of how Steve always delivers it. Most people who know of our work in the space know that 75% of venture capital goes to 3 places. And all of the work that we do, all of the investment, all the partnership, all of the focus on economic development is inspired by that one single fact. And there's been just tremendous learning, I think, around that. The final quick thing I'll say is Steve is also a great storyteller. And I think one of the first times I heard him, when we were out on the road on a tour, tell the story about, 1%, when he started AOL in the early days. I, I don't know if I'll get this exactly right, but I think the story goes like only 1% of the US was online, and it was only for like 3 hours a day or a week. I forget exactly what that last part is. But I remember the first time I heard him talk about that and link in his mind the connection between sort of leaning into and creating the future with AOL and drawing parallels for himself and the work that he and we are trying to do with Rise the Rest was just, kind of one of those that gave me chills moments. And it continues to be a source of inspiration, I think, in all the work that we do.
Here's what I want to know though. Does Steve ever drive the bus? Like maybe he goes and sits up there, he hangs a couple AOL CDs from the rearview mirror so they're spinning.
We do have professional bus drivers. It's a pretty big tour bus. So uh, we are he is on it. I have never seen him actually drive it.
So I was going to skip to my last question. I think the tech industry at large, but especially the venture capital market, has really struggled with diversity, equity, and inclusion over the years. And I know Rise of the Rest is really at the forefront of kind of embracing diversity, equity, and inclusion from a VC point of view. So I just wanted to ask, how has the progress been the last, I guess you've been with Revolution for 5 years. How do you think the VC industry is doing in terms of embracing, DEI?
My sense and my experience is that we're making progress. I see it in the now much more regular announcements of, many of our colleagues who are women or, GPs of color who are launching funds for the first time, raising second or third funds with, much larger numbers in AUM behind them. It looks like we're, as an industry, starting to do a better job. I think you see some of that too on the funder side in terms of what the composition of founders who are getting funded. But those anecdotes, like those anecdotal insights aside, I think when we still see the headline data come through year after year, the numbers are just still so incredibly sobering. From a female founder standpoint, we went backwards during COVID pretty dramatically. And the numbers were not all that impressive to begin with. And so I think we are living in an age more broadly of increased intentionality and focus, frankly, because we all sort of live and operate in the public eye in some capacity. And I think there's the potential for a more virtuous circle between what your customers and what your investors and what your team sort of demands that can hopefully create more momentum and more positive change on this front. One of the things I've been reflecting on, both with respect to geography and and diversity more broadly, is that I think we're maybe in a moment where it's helpful to dig deeper behind the headline numbers, because we do also have a tremendous amount of momentum in the asset class. And there are, an increasing number of later stage funds. And I say this with all the warmth in my heart, who are like weaponizing capital and, doing these very quick later stage rounds. That sort of inflates the overall numbers, I think, of invested capital in the space, both in the fund world and in the startup world. So, coming back to geography just for a minute as we close, the headline numbers haven't changed from the standpoint of 75% of venture capital still going to three places. But SVB put out a report a couple weeks ago where there was some really exciting data, I think, from our standpoint at Rise the Rest, which is that the percentage of early stage funding, early stage specifically, funding going to Bay Area startups has actually declined 15% in the last 10 years. And what's even more interesting to me, and I think to us, is that half of that decline has come in the last 15 months. So when you think about everything that COVID is accelerating, I think in certain ways, I think some of these shifts, you're starting to see more acceleration and more momentum. And so that even that just that one fact, that made me really want to double click on that and understand, like, where is that capital going and what does that look like? And so There's a lot more work to do. That's like really the short answer behind my longer winded answer. But I'm encouraged to see more people around the table. And I'm also encouraged by the seriousness and the size of check increasingly being committed in the public forum by institutional LPs and by the corporate community. I think in particular, like the corporate LP community can start to make a pretty big difference when it comes to funding both startups and fund managers from a founder of color or female founder perspective.
So one last question before you go, Anna. We try and ask this of all our guests, sticking with the theme of the podcast, nice book into it. Who is someone, or maybe it's a team or a startup that is really executing, or maybe it's flying under the radar that nobody hasn't heard of, that we should be paying attention to?
I have two companies in our portfolio. Just picking up on that last thread, one is led by an extraordinary female founder. The company is based in Seattle. It's called Flavor Cloud. And the business is a cross-border e-commerce enablement tool that really helps to empower every retailer to go global. Rothna recently closed a $6 million Series A round, and she's just flying. And she's one of the most capital efficient, sort of nose to the grindstone, execution oriented founders I've ever met in our portfolio, and the numbers don't lie. And so she's already, I think, come close to doubling monthly revenue since she closed that A. So I'm really excited for the prospects of that business and think she's riding a real wave of momentum in the e-commerce enablement and sort of supply chain resilience sectors. And the second is a newer company in our portfolio out of Salt Lake City. It's called Recyclops. And the company started as a consumer oriented, like recycling as a service business that focused on rural and smaller MSA communities that didn't have recycling services provided by their municipalities, in large part due to some changes from the international sort of regulatory landscape. And what I love so much about what's happened, and they are also just heads down executing so efficiently, is that their business has, I think, very quickly evolved not only into that consumer facing recycling as a service play, but actually now they're sort of leaning into this reverse logistics company that singularly focuses on sustainability and the opportunities that come from that. And that's created some really explosive B2B opportunities for them that I think are already and will continue to prove to be a shortcut from a market-based expansion standpoint that helped to take them from a regional to a national player pretty quickly. So super excited about them. And they also, the founder there is actually the younger brother of another founder in our portfolio who was one of our first investments back when we launched Rise the Rest a couple years ago. So I love seeing that connection come through for so many reasons.
Second generation of investees. That's great. Yeah. So listeners, check out Flavor Cloud and Recyclops. And if you Google Recyclops and see a picture of Dwight Schrute in a samurai outfit, that is the wrong Recyclops.
That is not them. Thank you guys so much for having me on. Congrats on the new podcast. And I can't wait to tune in to all your future episodes.
Thanks, Anna.
Thanks so much, Anna. It's been great to have you on today, and looking forward to keeping the conversations going in the years to come. We're really proud of all the good work you're doing at Rise of the Rest.
Thanks, Rob.